Hello, I'm Maya Stewart, and this is my presentation on POP3S and Smtps. So, starting off, the first one stands for an encrypted version of Post Office Protocol, therefore, it is receiving emails. In Linux, it's used on the Dovecot application. So to configure POP3S, the first thing we would do is ensure Dovecot is installed. To do that, we'd run the command sudo apt update and sudo apt install dovecot-core, dovecot-pop3d, and dovecot/imapd. After we install that, we would configure the Dovecot file, and I put how we could configure that. And then next, we're going to restart it. We'd run the command sudo service dovecot restart. And then next we go on to our SSL configure. And then I just put on here that POP3S uses port 995 because that can be helpful. In summary, to configure POP3S on Linux, you primarily need to edit the configuration file of your mail server, which is typically Dovecot, to enable the POP3S protocol, set the necessary SSL/TLS certificates, and to ensure firewall connections are on the 995 port. And then by modifying the appropriate rules, we'll need to restart the mail server service after we make changes. So then I have some hardening recommendations for POP3S. One is use strong passwords, of course. Enforce robust password policies with a mix of upper / lowercase letters, numbers, and special characters. Two-factor authentication. This can add an extra layer of security. Next, SSH key-based access. For server administration, use SSH key pairs instead of passwords for enhanced security. Monitor incoming traffic, so you want to log all POP3S access attempts for potential anomaly detection. And then finally, you want to do regular patching. Keep your Linux operating system and POP3 server software updated with the latest security patches. So next we have SMTPS. This is used on Windows with IIS and on the postfix application on Linux. So we have a little diagram there. So SMTPS stands for Simple Mail Transfer Protocol Secure. It's a way to secure email communication between servers using encryption and authentication. To configure SMPTS on Linux, the step one would be to install postfix. Then we're going to update the system package repository. Then install postfix by running that command. After we install postfix, we're going to check the service status. Next, we would edit the configuration files and configure SMTP username and passwords. So I put the files of how we would access the username and passwords and a text editor that creates if the file doesn't exist. We would add the following file for username and password preferences. And then, of course, when we're done, we'll save the changes and exit. Next, we would create a hash database file. So put how we would do that. Next, we would set up a host name parameter and relay server in the configuration file. We would set up the relay server you would want the file to look like the listed. So that's how we would configure that on Linux. Moving on to Windows, first would install the SMTP server feature. We would open Server Manager and go to Manage, add roles and features, and locate the SMTP server and install it, and ensure IIS6 Management Console is also installed because it's required for the SMTP configuration. Step 2 would be configure SMTP service in IIS. So we'd open up the IIS manager, find the SMTP virtual server, right click and choose properties. Under the General tab, ensure it's running and configured for the correct IP. So step 3, we have enable TLS for secure SMTP. So we'd right click on the virtual server and click properties, go to the access tab, click authentication, and enable anonymous and basic authentication, click connection, and specify the allowed IP address if necessary, click relay, and configure the allowed relay settings. And then you would access the delivery tab and click the outbound security. Select basic authentication, enable TLS encryption, and enter the SMTP credentials if that's required, and then just click OK and apply. Then you would configure SMTP ports for SSL/TLS. We'd open the firewall and allow outbound connections on port 465 and port 587. Next, after we've done all this, we're going to test the SMTP server. We can use telnet using this telnet command, or we can send a test email using PowerShell. And then for the final step, you're going to verify email logs, check the SMTP logs in the Windows/Systems32 log files. And if you encounter errors, you can access that for troubleshooting. So for hardening recommendations for Linux on SMPTS, step 1, install and update postfix. Ensure postfix is installed and up to date. So really just keep postfix up to date, like you want to keep everything up to date. Step 2 is prevent open relay, so spam protection, and you can modify the restrictions as listed. And then for step 3, you're going to want to limit email rate, so prevent abuse. To limit the outbound email rates, you can access the following files. So then for hardening recommendations on Windows, you're going to want to restrict relay to prevent open relay attacks. To do this, we'd open the IIS manager, expand the server node and click SMTP virtual server, right click on the server, click properties, navigate to the access tab and click relay, and select only listed below, and click what you want allowed, and unchecked allow all computers which successfully authenticate to relay unless required. Step 2 is enable TLS for secure email transmission. In IIS Manager, go to SMTP virtual server properties, click the Delivery tab, click Outbound Security, check the TLS encryption, and authentication of credentials if needed. Under the outbound connections, you're going to set the SMTP port to port 465 and port 587. For step 3, we have require authentication for sending emails. We do this by going to the SMTP virtual server properties, going to the Access tab, click Authentication, and enable basic authentication if using username/passwords. Enable integrated Windows authentication for domain accounts, and disable anonymous access unless explicitly required. So that's all the information on Windows and Linux for the hardening recommendations. And then we have our works cited, and that is all for my PowerPoint.